Hey guys, Parfax here, and today we're going to be talking about how to gear your character out for PVE dungeons. Alright, let's get started. Alright, before you guys go ahead and roast me in the comment section down below, I understand they're called expeditions and not dungeons, but let's be honest, they're dungeons. So when it comes to doing PVE in New World, there's a couple things you should consider. Now, what I'm going to tell you here is just what I believe to be the best way to gear your character out. I'm not saying it's the only way, and we will talk about specifically 2 different ways to gear out your character, but it's honestly what I believe is the best. Now, I will tell you what I did at first and tell you where I think I went wrong. And what I did first was I actually got a set of Void Bent. I leveled it to 625 with a couple different weapons. I'm like, well, I can use this in pretty much every setup. I can run any setup. And I leveled up my, let's say, Lasbow. I leveled up, some random Great Axe, random, Fire Staff, and everything like that. I didn't really tailor anything around any specific dungeon. What that ended up doing was, well, it really ended up hurting the team. We didn't get through dungeons as smoothly. We could have done them a lot faster. And honestly, it wasn't that helpful. So you can do it that way. And when it comes to your equip load, we'll talk about that real quick. Honestly, for anybody starting out, I'm going medium. Medium is just all around probably the best for new players. And if you're not really sure on your melee, and maybe you're running something that's a little bit, well, it doesn't have a ton of defenses, then I'm probably definitely staying with medium. Once you get it down and you get really good pieces of gear, then I would go light. But honestly, I wouldn't be too quick to get to light armor, because light armor is really good. It does 10% more damage, but you also take 10% more damage approximately. It's probably not exactly 10%, but you do take a nice chunk more damage. And yeah, it's not quite worth it if you're going to die. But I'm definitely going to stay at the medium equip load, at least until you get really good with the dungeons. So if we're not just going to spam all my gear to 625, how are we going to do it? So first, let's talk about the weapons, and the weapon is pretty easy. So on this character, this is my alt. I planned on doing Rapier DPS as a main, and then I planned on swapping between specifically bow and probably hatchet, maybe ice gauntlet, depending on which dungeon I'm doing. But I wanted to be a Rapier main. So what I did was I went ahead and got a bunch of Bane weapons. I got Vicious Ancient, Vicious Corrupted, Vicious Lost, and Vicious Angry Earth. Now, you don't actually have to get Vicious. Rogue is a little bit better, but there's a lot of specific mobs in the game that actually have a harder hitbox to hit when it comes to, back attacks. And specifically, Ancient Bane in the last instrumentality actually isn't the best for Rogue, because the first boss, Scylla, I only consider there to be 2 bosses. But Scylla herself has a really weird hitbox. You have to basically hit her in the tail, and it's like a very small portion of the tail to actually get the rogue proc. And then on Shardis, there actually isn't a rogue proc. So you're kind of stuck with just not rogue, hitting rogue on any of your targets. So we go with Vicious because it's a lot more well-rounded. So honestly, I think going a Bane and Vicious on any of your weapons is really good. You can, of course, get Rogue. And if you're running something like a Fire Staff Ice Gauntlet, I think Keen Bane is actually pretty good too. You probably still want Vicious, but Keen actually might outperform it. I'm not 100% sure on that one. I tend to stick to the melee side, because the melee side's a little bit more flexible, or you can run more dungeons with very short amount of melee. Because if you don't know, when it comes to mutations, and we'll talk about that in a very little bit, but you actually have fire and ice as mutations. So if you're running one of those, you basically just can't run that weapon. So you can't run an ice in an ice, because you basically don't do any damage. So I don't do a ton of that. I have fire set for Genesis, but I tend to stick to melee because it's a lot more viable in more situations. So we've established that we want Bane Vicious. Now, you don't technically on your utility weapon. So typically the way it works is you're going to have a main weapon and a utility weapon. For instance, when I'm running my bow and rapier setup, this is my PvP setup, I'm actually running bow as my main, rapier as my secondary. If I was to swap, let's say we're doing Angry Earth. This is Angry Earth. So let's go here, here. Let's say this is the combo that I was doing for Angry Earth. This probably wouldn't be the combo because this is going to do so much damage, but let's just say that's what we're doing. I'm going to be using, let's say, the rapier as my main. Let's say, you know, this does more damage than the hatchet. I know it doesn't, but let's just say it does. Then I would worry about getting Bane on what I consider to be my main weapon. And then I'd be okay with having not a Bane on my backbar weapon. Of course you want it. And in normal instances, if I was going to run the build that I have on my YouTube channel, let's say this is a spear, then I would just maybe want like a fortifying perforate here. I would try to get something that's a little bit more utility. I'm not going to be on this bar that much. I'm just going to use it for the utility of it. I don't necessarily need a Bane, and you do want a Bane, but if you're going to level up one weapon and it's going to be basically utility, or maybe you have a corrupted one that you're going to be main DPSing in corrupted dungeons, so you have corrupted and vicious. You could run that, get that to 625, and use it as your utility weapon. Yeah, you might want to swap gems in and out, but you know, you'll still be able to use it. But whatever your main DPS weapon is, whether it's hatchet, great axe, spear, bow, you want to make sure you have Bane Vicious as kind of like that base. That is your base for the weapons you want. The Bane, once you start putting Bane on your weapon, I promise you will not go back. The amount of damage output Bane has plus any other damaging perk is so crazy that once you start using it, you're not going to go back. So we've established that for beginners, you want to be in the medium equip load. We've established that you want to have a Bane and probably Vicious on your weapon. Let's talk a little bit about armor. I'm not talking about weight here. We're talking about what pieces of gear and maybe, well, what perks we want on it. So you can see here, this is my PvP helm, critical retribution, refreshing evasion, resilient. Honestly, the only perk here that's any good is refreshing evasion. Refreshing evasion is pretty good if you stack it up a little bit. But honestly, when it comes to PvE, the only thing that I'm worried about is wards. You can see here if we have a corrupted ward, angry earth ward, corrupted ward, ancient ward, and angry earth ward. So we really want to pump out as much ward as possible. And the way I like to do it is this way. So as you can see here, we have 2 pairs of boots. What I like to do is pick 3 pieces of gear, and I like to put them as ward. So let's say it's the legs, gloves, boots. So legs, gloves, boots. Those are the 3 pieces that I'm going to have wards on. Now what I can do is I can probably put a weapon perk on these 2 pieces right here. Typically your PvE setups, you only want 2 weapon perks. You do sometimes want a little bit more, but normally there's 1 or 2 perks that you really must have. So for instance, for the hatchet, the thing you want is refreshing torrent. And then on the rapier, you want leeching flurry. Same thing if you're running spear, like I have in my other build, you want fortifying perforate. So that's where I would put my 2 pieces of gear right here. Whichever 2 pieces they are, I would definitely put a weapon perk on them. So the other 3, I would run wards. Now what this allows you to do, especially if you're running, for instance, hatchet spear, like in my build, you can actually just go and you can keep these 2 pieces always the same. You can keep your jewelry always the same. All you're going to do is you're going to swap out these 3 pieces and your main weapon. Remember, on the secondary weapon, we don't necessarily have to have that with a Bane on it. Of course, we would like to, and we want to tailor all of our builds around having that secondary weapon being Biss as well. But because it's not the weapon we're using a ton of damage on, we don't technically need to, you know, swap it out. So we're going to be looking for 3 ward pieces here, and we're going to be looking for 1 weapon. So we've essentially, instead of having a full 10 pieces of gear, right, that we always are running the same thing, but our builds are kind of, well, pretty crap, we're going to be, I know, swapping 4 pieces of gear out every time, but we're essentially taking a build that's kind of crap, and we're turning it into a build that's actually really good for only 4 pieces of gear. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be these 3 pieces. It's just 3 random pieces that I like, that I checked. If you have, what I do is if you have a good piece of gear that's probably good for PvE, I would slot them there. So the best pieces, I kind of touched on this a little bit, are of course wards. Wards are going to be your best, but those 3 ward pieces, you're probably going to want to slot in the same 3 spots every time. And then we want stuff like refreshing evasion. Refreshing ward is pretty much useless unless you're the tank, and it's not even that good on the tank, because if you're blocking, you don't actually proc refreshing ward. So you're still really kind of looking for refreshing. And then you have stuff like invigorated, vigor, and stuff like that, but those are very minor and really not needed. So honestly, when it comes to PvE, probably your BIS would be weapon perk, ward, refreshing, or ward, refreshing, and then honestly, luck. If you can get those 3 on a piece of gear, you're pretty much set. If you can get even a weapon perk, refreshing, and luck, then you can basically slot it into a piece of your gear and you won't have to complete it. Are there ways to probably eke out a little bit more? Yeah, but honestly, when it comes to the DPS side of it, the only things you're really looking for is some cooldown reduction and some weapon perks. The defensive side, the main thing you're looking for here is just ward. All the other stuff sometimes doesn't even seem to work. I run invigorated. I actually have 3 or 4 pieces of invigorated on my barnacle set, and honestly, it doesn't seem to lower the rend at all. So, you know, it is what it is. So we've established that, yes, we want to have our weapon perks. We want to have our ward pieces that we are going to swap out for each dungeon. Now let's go to jewelry. Now, of course, when it comes to jewelry, you don't want shirking empowerment. You don't want any of the PvP perks. But honestly, for your necklace, as long as you have health, you're probably in good shape. Stamina recovery is probably one of the best perks you can have here as well. But if you have health and divine, you know, or just even health, you're probably set here. You don't really need to worry too much about it. Is there a way to min-max it a little bit more? Yes. But when it comes to getting in the dungeon, you're not really looking at min-maxing your stuff. You're really just looking at getting a set that's going to be good enough. There's a ton of stuff out there on your server that is health and anything good. You can get a health, divine, refreshing. That's probably your best PvE. If not, you can get something like health, divine, stamina recovery. Or honestly, like I said, if you can get like a health refreshing, it'll be just fine and you really won't notice it. Next, when it comes to your ring, we honestly don't have a very good PvE ring at all. We're running Immortal Empowerment. This character isn't at all set for mutations. We have started getting gear for mutations. But when it comes to your ring, honestly, people use the smooth bone and people use the featherweight. But I hate to say it, for PvE, they're kind of trash. When it comes to melee, you don't want keen awareness. You can get it if you're running like ancient, it's not bad. But honestly, you're looking for slashing, you're looking for thrust. You're going to be back attacking a lot. So you really don't need the crit, because crit doesn't do anything when you're hitting them in the back. So you're really looking for that. If you're looking for an all-around ring that you can run everywhere, I would honestly just get like a con, keen awareness, and refreshing is probably going to be the best set of perks you can get. Like I said, we're running medium armor, medium equip load, so we don't actually need hardy. If you're running light, obviously some are going to need hardy, but because we're running medium, we don't actually need hardy here. Here, the 2 things we want refreshing toast, and we want, again, some form of cooldown reduction. There's a ton of earrings in the game. We're not going to go over each one, but this is one I bought super quickly on the auction house, and it was refreshing evasion, refreshing toast, duplicating toast. Saved me a little bit of coin by sometimes not using my potions. And I have refreshing toast and refreshing evasion on it, and it's pretty dang good. So that is what I'm running. And pretty much anything that's refreshing toast and any form of refreshing on it is going to do you just fine. All right, now that we've talked about gear and what pieces of gear that you should be putting on, you know, your character, let's next talk about a couple weapon combinations, or maybe a couple weapons you probably should stay away from. So first, I'm going to say it again, hatchet spear, you cannot go wrong. Now, next patch, they're going to do a thing to where you're not going to have to, you know, be punished by running specific weapons. So mobs aren't going to have a natural resistance to things. Now, when we run mutations, and we can look at Tempest's mutation right now, I believe, on this server. We haven't been up to Tempest, but it's the Hellfire mutation, which means Fire Staff, you're basically not going to be able to use it in Tempest. So whenever there's a mutation, so you can see here, we can go here at the Overgrown mutation. If you look down here, I can't actually point to it because as soon as I point to it, it goes off my cursor. But if you see the very last thing, it says enemies deal 50% of all damage as nature. And then it says 2 up from that nature resistance. Enemies have 50% nature absorption. That means you'll be doing 50% less damage with nature. So whenever a mutation has anything like that on it, you should not, and will do absolutely like no damage if you're using any of those elements. So when it comes to weapon pairings, of course, like I said, hatchet spear, I would go there. After that, Great Axe, Warhammer. It's never going to be the top DPS, but it's very utility DPS oriented. It's never bad to have a Great Axe in your kit because Gravwell plus Maelstrom is a great tool to have. It's really going to allow the hatchets to really pump out the crazy amount of damage. Rapier is never a bad setup. You can run, here's a suggestion. If you're going to run Intelligence, I'm leveling up Rapier, and I'm going to have a Rapier main with either ice or fire as secondary. If you do it that way, then you can always have a weapon that is very strong. Now, when you do the Rapier and with the Ice Gauntlet Fire Staff, you probably need to go more Dex and then Int as a secondary stat, but you'll still be able to run your Ice Gauntlet Fire Staff. And you can still go the 300 Int, and it's just not going to do quite as much damage. Weapons that I'm definitely going to stay away from, honestly, Musket, Sword and Shield, Blunderbuss are not very good. Main weapons to not use would probably like Void Gauntlet, and honestly, Bow. Bow does not do that much damage. It's okay. It's a very safe weapon to play, and especially if you can start getting off your, rapid shots and you have some decent amount of damage with that. But Bow is definitely in the lower tier of damage. It does lower damage than, Fire Staff. It does lower damage than all the melee weapons. So it's not bad, but it's definitely like low to middle tier. Blunderbuss is pretty bad. It does a lot of damage per shot, but it has to reload, so its damage per second is very low. Sword and Shield's very okay. It's honestly kind of the Bow of melee, and you can do it, but it makes you actually squishier when you're on your opposite bar, and it doesn't bring a ton of utility, so I kind of stay away from it. But you can honestly run almost anything as a main weapon. You can even run Void Gauntlet in like Ancient. You run like the melee side of Void Gauntlet. It's not terrible. And then Fire Staff is never the best, but it can be very safe and still do a decent amount of damage. But when it comes to DPS, you can never go wrong with Rapier, Hatchet, Spear, Great Axe, Warhammer to some extent. And yeah. And then of course your Fire Staff is your magic weapon that does the most damage. Other than, Rapier, but Rapier is a melee weapon and not a magic weapon. But pretty much just don't run Musket. Probably don't run Sword and Shield. And I would probably not advise you to run Blunderbuss. Even in Corrupted Dungeons, the Blunderbuss just does so significantly less damage comparatively to like Spear, Hatchet, Rapier, even Bow, Fire Staff. So keep that in mind. Next, when it comes to attributes, what should you run? Obviously, it differs from person to person, but if you want to look at Hatchet and Spear, like I said, you can look in the description down below. I did pin the comment because I actually forgot to talk about it. But what I'm going to start off is whatever your main stat is. For instance, if I'm going to run Rapier, I'm going to go 300 Dex, and then I'm going to go start off with 200 Con. Now, when it comes to that, you're going to find really quickly that 200 Con is way too much, but that's where I would start, and then I would slowly start moving it down. Remember that if you have a 2-stat weapon, like the Hatchet, like the Rapier, it might not actually be beneficial to go 300 points into one stat. For instance, for Hatchet and Spear, sometimes it might be better to go 200. Now, if you want to push it all the way to the top DPS, you want to go 300, 200, but some weapons you can get away with, well, not stacking. But let's say I'm running rapier, I go 300 dex, then I have 50 more points to put in. I'm definitely going to go 50 int. Now, if you're running a melee weapon, especially rapier, you always want to have 50 int. If you are very comfortable in back attacking, back attacks do count as critical hits, and you can actually put 50 points in here. For instance, if I'm running barnacles and I run hatchet ice gauntlet, that's actually what I run in barnacles. I actually run, I believe it's 300 strength, or no, 200 strength, I think 200 dex, 50 int is the stat line that I run. And then I believe it's 50 con. So it's 2, 4, 50. Yeah, so that's what I run. I run 200, 250. So you actually like that extra 10% critical damage. We do lose out on a little bit of damage here, but we definitely gain it back because we are always back attacking. You know, if you're running Laz, it's not that helpful because you're not going to be critting that much. But when it comes to specific dungeons and specific situations, this passive is really, really good. Now, if you're running something like Spear, you 300 points in a dex, you always want to have this 50-point passive, 10% to physical, light, and heavy attacks. It would be okay to go 250 dex and then 50 strength to get this passive. This passive is going to be one of your best passives you can possibly have. So you want to make sure you get it. So basically anything that does a physical damage and you basic attack a lot, you want to get the strength passive. If you're always back attacking, you do want to get the int passive as well, if you can. Other than that, you want to just put it into the main stat and then put as much con and then just slowly decrease the con over time. I wouldn't go, if you're like, oh, I didn't die from 200, I wouldn't go down to 50, but I would put it down 50-point passive as well. But remember, if you're doing PVE, you don't actually have to hit the 150 passive. You do want to hit the 200 passive if you're going to go there. And you definitely want to hit the 150-point passive. But the 150-point passive doesn't do anything for you in PVE situations. All right, before we wrap this video up and give you my final couple thoughts, I want to make sure if you guys got to this far, let me know in the comment section down below if you are excited for the next patch or not. I am super excited. Let me know if you plan on playing fresh start servers, or just let me know what is your favorite thing you are looking forward to in Brimstone. And whichever one's my favorite in the first couple days, I'm probably going to go ahead and pin it. So go ahead and put that in the comment section down below, and I will read every single one of them. I try to respond to most of them, but YouTube's been pretty popping off lately, and it's been great. You guys have been absolutely fantastic, and I do read every comment. Sometimes I don't get a chance to comment back to them. Sometimes you'll see that I'll just run off 20 or 30 comments in a row and comment on everybody's posts. So I do read them, and I try to remember to go back and go ahead and comment on each one of them. Unless you're too trolly, then I don't. But like I said, let me know in the comment section down below if you're looking forward to Brimstone or Fresh Start servers, and what you're looking forward to really in both of them. So last couple things to check off here is, and it's not really about gearing at all, but if you're going to do the dungeons, make sure you go ahead and check to see right there, boom, Tempest Heart. We can get an expedition down, and because I haven't done a mission today, that's a quick 8,200. Specifically, Laz is probably the most profitable one to run. They almost always have a bunch of, quests that you can do. Same thing with Jen. So whatever dungeon you are running in whatever town, whether it's Tempest for Shattered Mountain, it's Reekwater for Laz, make sure you go to your faction vendor in that city to make sure you pick up the quest, because you're probably going to need it. Next, I want to talk a little bit about, well, some of the stuff you probably should have before doing mutations. First, that is going to be, let me find it here, trophies. Now, you don't need to get all the way up to the basic, but honestly, the basic ones aren't that big of a deal. You do want to make sure you have the base ones, which I believe they're called minors. So you want to make sure you have each one of these for each mob type. They're very cheap to get. The materials are very cheap. So if you can't afford them on the marketplace, farm up the materials, and I'm sure a trophy map person would gladly make it for you. These are going to be 3% damage per trophy, and at base minimum, that is 9% extra damage you're going to do. And that's at the base trophy. Now, while leveling them up, you're going to get 1% each on every one of them. I don't think the major one is worth it at all. That's a major investment for 1% bonus damage, but at least get to the basic ones, which they're pretty cheap, and they give you quite a bit of damage. So make sure you get your trophies. Next, when it comes to potions, of course, you want to have your health potions, but you want to make sure you also have coatings. You don't necessarily need to get the infused ones. The infused ones can be pretty expensive. Do I have any on me? I do not, because on this character, you know, I don't really have a bunch. But the powerful coatings are very cheap, and I would make sure that you bring some, because I would be very upset if I was doing mutations with somebody and they didn't want to spend the extra like 10 coins to make a set of coatings or to buy them off the marketplace. So make sure you're bringing coatings, of course your food, and of course honing stones. I don't have any on me, but you don't need to run the highest tier, the powerful honing stones or infused honing stones, whatever they're called. But you run the one step down. They are like 50 or 60 coins, but you're going to make plenty of that money up in the dungeon. Now, one thing that's a little bit underrated is actually using gemstone dust. Obviously, I'm not using tier 5, but if you have a lot of the lower ones, sometimes I have used them in kind of tight spots. Now, this is a little bit more min-maxing, and when you're getting into the dungeons, you don't really need them. And when you get used to them, you don't really need them as well. But they're honestly, it's good to have a handful of them just on your inventory, just in case, specifically like the fire ones. If you don't quite have all the fire rubies, which we'll talk about the rubies here in a second, or the gems, but it's really nice to have these. So if you get the case where you need to stay in the fire, or you know you're about to take damage, go ahead and pop one, and you have 20 seconds or 15 hits of not a whole lot of damage. When it comes to gemming out your gear, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. First, let's go ahead in my Windsword bank here so we can see what gems I have. Oh, I guess I don't have many in here. Is it an Everfall? All right, we have our Everfall gems. So you do want to make sure that you're putting gems in your gear. When you look at the mutation, it'll say they do 50% of one element. For instance, we have a fire ruby in here. So if I was doing the Tempest mutation and I have, you know, since it is Hellfire, I do want to put a full set of rubies in here. Not only will it mitigate the fire damage that's in there, it'll actually help mitigate 50% of their damage. Now, they will still do 50% non of that element, but because these are, if you see here, 4.9%, oh, so that's the resilient, but 6% fire damage absorption versus 4.8 physical, or sorry, 2.5 damage absorption for physical. These are just so significantly better, and they provide such a good defense. Do you necessarily, when you start off, need to put pristines in here? No, but I would definitely start putting the very slightly, instead of putting pristines, put in the brilliance in there, because they are going to provide you some of the most defenses you can possibly have. They are basically about like putting almost a full ward piece of gear on each ruby that you have. It is an absolute must that you put, especially for specific ones, put as many in your gear as possible. Now, if you have the two pieces of gear and you're really cheap, you can put an opal in there, but it is significantly worse than putting a whatever elemental type is in there. So honestly, I would bite the bullet, and you're going to be changing your gear out every single time. Now, you've started buying gear, you have your weapons, but now you need to know exactly what you should be doing. You've got your gear, you know, you're ready to roll. What are we doing? So, for instance, next week it's going to be Laz and Jen. So, I'm going to build out my ancient set because Laz is just the easiest. And we're going to build out my ancient set, and I'm going to run Laz as many times as possible. I may be tempted to go into Genesis. Genesis happens to be a dungeon that you can go in with no wards. Remember, people are going into these dungeons, or we were, with no wards already. So if you're leveling up a set of gear with wards, specifically, let's say Ancient Ward, so you can do Laz and you can feel really good about yourself doing it. And then if you swap over and you go to do Genesis, you're going to be basically where you would be if you just did it and geared what I consider the bad way. So I would gear out for Laz. I would run it as much as possible. This is a multi-step process. And then next week, if you want to run, let's say, Dynasty, remember, we have a tier list here, right? We have Gen and Laz are going to be your two easiest ones. And then it's probably Barnacles, then Tempest, then Depths, then Dynasty. It's kind of how the difficulty goes. Depending on the mutation, it can get even more difficult. So honestly, I would skip the corrupted ones. I'd maybe get your codex up a couple times, but I wouldn't start gearing really towards them until you have a decent amount of shards. Once you can start getting 10, 20, 50, 60, 80,000 shards, not necessarily 80, but once you can start really getting your last codex up, you have 25 attempts in 1 week. Should you do 25 in a week? I mean, if you can, do it. The most I've done is like 15 or something like that. Or I don't even think, I've never hit 20, I don't think, at least not since they've come out with the counter. But I'm going to gear out for Laz, and then I'm going to go from there. But remember, people are gearing out their sets to not even have ward as well. So you're going to have a warded set for Laz that will be no different than if you had a non-warded set and went into Dynasty. This is the reason why I think building a specific set, and Laz is the one I would pretty much build 100% of the time, because when it is up, you're going to run it nonstop. But people are you're going to gear out your character to 625 and run a non-warded set anyway. So you might as well go ahead and ward out a nice ancient set so that you can really blast through these. But if you still want to dabble in the other ones when they're up, you can. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully I didn't talk too much about the same thing over and over again. But honestly, I get this question quite a lot, and I've explained this to quite a few people. Let me know in the comment section down below, you know, where I went right, where I went wrong, what's a little bit confusing. I will try to answer them in the comment section down below as soon as possible. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.